the presentation, go ahead and submit it online by clicking on the Q&A tab located on the right-hand side of your WebEx window. Make sure it's the Q&A tab and not the chat, so we can also have your email address in case your question needs a follow-up reply after the session has ended. When you're in the Q&A window, simply type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen, and then go ahead and hit send. If you do end up using the chat window instead of Q&A, make sure to address your question to the presenter, not the host. That will actually send it to Brian so he can go ahead and see that instead of me, because Brian will be the one leading today's session. We will attempt to address all of your questions during the presentation. After the formal presentation is ended, we will review and answer any of the remaining questions. And as I mentioned, your presenter today is going to be Brian Laird. He's the Senior Web Technologist at OmniUpdate. So Brian, with that, I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Brandon. And as Brandon mentioned, we'll be going over site clone today. And so site clone can be a very useful feature in OU Campus. And so let me just talk a little bit about what we're going to go over. First, we'll talk about what we're talking about when we say site clone and what is it. We'll talk a little bit about how you actually clone a site in OU Campus. Then we'll go a little bit into the dependency manager and how that interacts with site clone, alternatives that you can use, as well as best practices for site clone. So with that, let's just jump on in, and I'll talk a little bit about what the site clone feature is in OU Campus. And simply put, site clone is just a way to create a new OU Campus site based off of the settings and the files that you have from an existing site. So if you want to duplicate your site settings or the files or anything that you have from your existing site and kind of have a fresh site that you have based off of what's already there, then you can use a site clone for that. It is used typically when you have a different domain or different subdomain that you're publishing to. In that case, so you can't necessarily publish from one site in OU Campus. You can't publish to two different subdomains. So one reason that you would need a different site that you would clone to would be for if you had a different domain or a subdomain. Again, there are different alternatives, ways that you can go about this as well, but site clone is one of the reasons that you might want to do that. And when you are doing a site clone, there are things to keep in mind of what you can actually retain from your source site that you are coming from. And so some of these notable settings and different files that you can retain include binaries. That would be any images, PDFs, anything that's not really text-based. Any of those can be retained with a site clone. You can also keep your snippets, any access settings that you have, if they're at the directory level or at the page level, those can actually come across as well. If you have any directory variable settings in your source site that you want to preserve, site clone would be a good reason to bring those across that way, and it would come across nicely. And you can also use it to preserve templates and template groups that you may have set up in your source site that you wouldn't want to have to recreate, or maybe you want to have and you just want to modify for the new site. There are other things that you can also bring across, but these are kind of some of the most notable pieces that you can do when you're doing a site clone. So when you get all this information and you decide, yes, the site clone does make sense, it's important to know how you actually do it. And so what you have to do is you do have to be a level 10 administrator. If you have a different access setting that's less than level 10, you won't be able to access the site clone. But assuming that you have level 10 administrator privileges in OU Campus, what you would do is you would navigate to set up sites, and that's in the drop-down near the top right. This setup, and you just hover over it and you see sites. And then you'll get the list, and you can just hover over whatever site you want to clone from, and you just hover to where you see the actions drop-down, and you click the clone button there, and that'll allow you to enter in what looks like the regular site settings, but it'll have a lot of the fields pre-populated for you at that time. so what you'll do is you'll actually enter a unique site name. You'll enter your production server FTP settings. It does have to be a unique combination of production server FTP settings that is not currently being used, just like when you're creating any other site in IU Campus. And then if there's any other settings that you want to change in that initial list that you can create there, you could adjust those if you want to change your template location or any of those other common site settings. Then you click the button at the bottom, it'll say create, and the site clone will be created. If you tell it to copy the staging files over, it'll copy all those files into your new staging environment as well. And you will have the new site that you can then publish to. So once you're done, you do want to actually make sure that everything worked correctly, that you can publish your files, that you can view the files after you publish them and see everything together. And that's really it. So as far as the process is concerned, it's a pretty simple process to kind of go through there. But once you do that, you're done. So what you do is you can actually start working with your new site. If you want to set any directory variables, access settings, and so on, you really have a new site to play with that you can change anything you want to at that time. So this is just kind of a brief overview of how you would do it, and I will go over and show this in action in OU Campus here in a little bit, but that's the general process for you there. So the next thing that I wanted to go over with this is talking a little bit about Dependency Manager. Because when you are doing a site clone, you have different combinations of if you have Dependency Manager enabled or not enabled on your sites. So if you think about it, you have two sites that you're working with. You have your source site, where you're copying your settings and or files from, and you have your clone site, which is the one that will be created that you are cloning to. So it's the source and then the clone. Now, in either one of those sites, you could have Dependency Manager enabled, or you might have it disabled depending on your preferences. And really, depending on which combination you use here, whether they're both enabled, one's not enabled, you really have 4 different combinations that could be in place. And that does affect a little bit how the site will behave as far as dependency tags are concerned. So in this case, in this first example that I have here, you can see, and this would be the preferred setting, is you have Dependency Manager enabled on your source site. Everything was scanned in Dependency Manager, and you see those wonderful little dependency tags that keep track of your links and so on for you. If you're not familiar with what they look like, it's those couple squiggly braces, and inside of those you see a letter with a colon and then some numbers, and that's just your ID. So when you have Dependency Manager enabled on your source site, and then you also have Dependency Manager enabled on your clone site when you're doing it afterwards, what happens is the source files will be copied over from the source to the clone site. Then what happens is the Dependency Manager will actually revert the scan of the tags in that site, so that way it's not pointing to the source site anymore. And then it'll just rescan the clone site since you have Dependency Manager enabled, and so all of those links will now point to the equivalent pages on the clone site. So the result that you have in this is the best thing that you want to have is all your dependency tags, dependency tags that you had on your source site pointing to pages within your source site are now going to be removed, and in your clone site, you're going to have pages that point to your clone site. So you're not going to have them pointing to each other or linking to an old location or whatever. Again, this is the recommended way of doing this, but there are other combinations, and it's good to be aware of your options and the effects of what each one has. So the second example that we have here is if you have Dependency Manager still enabled on your source site, but on your clone site that you are creating, you decide to deselect Dependency Manager and have it disabled. So like you did before, when the process goes through, OU Campus will again copy your files over to the new site. And then what happens is Dependency Manager, like the first time, it's going to revert the scan of the tags that you had there. And so this is, based off of the link formats that you had in the clone site settings for URLs. So if you have the clone site set for absolute or root relative links, when it does that revert, it's going to actually convert them to the proper format. And when you do this, what you're going to have is you're going to have a clone site, but you're not going to have any dependency manager tags on them. All the dependency manager tags you had in your source site are now just going to be URLs that are absolute or root relative to itself, and they're not going to point back to the clone site, or to the source site, excuse me there. So that's your second possibility of what you can do there. The third possibility is that you actually did not have Dependency Manager enabled on your source site. It was disabled for whatever reason. Maybe you used them at one point, but then you disabled it. For whatever reason, you might want to, that might have happened. But you want to use Dependency Manager going on your clone site, so you go ahead and you click that. Now, when you do this and the source site is disabled and the clone site Dependency Manager is enabled, what happens is the source files, again, are always copied to the new site. And then what happens is the Dependency Manager is going to create links on that clone site using the clone site settings. Again, if they're absolute or root relative. But what happens is when you do this, you're going to have dependency tags that may or may not point to the clone. And the reason is you might actually have some pre-existing dependency tags that were on the source site that did not get reverted because Dependency Manager was enabled. And this is the way the system works. So you could potentially have dependency tags that pointed to the clone, but if you had any links that were scanned within the clone site that were not in Dependency Manager initially, then those would point to the source site as desired. So again, just highlighting the best case scenario would be if they're both enabled, but this is the behavior if you happen to have the source site having Dependency Manager disabled and the clone site enabled. The last possibility here is you could actually have Dependency Manager disabled on both the source site and on the clone site. So in this case, we're not using Dependency Manager at all. Everything's, just going to be, potentially just manually used, or for whatever reason you don't want to use it here. And when you do this, again, you copy the site files, but there's no Dependency Manager scanning, and there's no unscanning. Nothing gets reverted either. It just is literally a true copy of the source site, whatever state that the files are in. So when you have any dependency tags that may have existed on the source site before you disabled Dependency Manager, those are going to point to the original site because you really did not change anything at all. It was a literal copy-paste essentially there. So when you have that, be aware if you had any Dependency Manager tags in your source site before you disabled them, it's going to do a true copy when you have both disabled for Dependency Manager there. So it's something to, just keep in mind when you're using the site clone. The big thing to really keep in mind there is, first, do you have any dependency tags in your source site? And if you do, you're probably going to want to have the source site enabled and the clone site enabled. And then afterwards, you could always revert. But that would be kind of a best practice, which I will get to here in a minute.
Hey, so Brian, we've also got a question that has come in during these examples.
Sure.
So the question was, if a published target for the clone site is a copy of the original production site, the HTML pages will have the editor login link that points to the original staging site. Do you suggest doing a total site publish of the clone site, or instead run a script on the new clone productions target to change each HTML file's login link to point to the clone staging site? So I think they're mostly talking about like what happens with direct edit links when you have a site clone and the clone site is pointing to, I guess, the same production target as kind of the original site?
Yeah. And so what will happen in that case is, first of all, when you're creating a clone site, The production target will have to have something that's slightly different than the original one, even if it's just a subfolder that's different. Otherwise, OU Campus won't actually let you point two sites to the same exact settings for the production server settings. When that happens, you will, it'll create the site for you. If you copy the files over, everything will be copied over. And then what you would want to do is you would want to publish out the clone site so that your dependency tags do come across. If you, for instance, in the example that we're looking at right now where you had dependency manager disabled everything, we're doing a true copy of the site. Right now at that point, when you copy it over, the sites, the files that have been copied are not published until you actually publish them after the site clone. And so in that point, whether or not, you wanted to, worry about direct edit links or anything else, you will need to publish your files after you have done a site clone. And when you publish your files, OU Campus will then regenerate those direct edit links. Hopefully that answers the question there. All right. So the next thing that I did want to talk about here is some alternatives. And this does kind of also follow a little bit with that question there of when kind of talking about when you want to do a site clone, because there are times when maybe you actually want to use some alternative to site clone that may serve your purposes better. So sometimes you might not want to clone your site, and maybe you just actually want to create a new site from scratch. And you just, start in OU Campus. You just hit the New Site button there under when you're setting up your sites, and you would enter in your information just like with a site clone, but you would just manually input it initially. And then you would have a nice pristine environment that you could then customize and do whatever you want to, add your files. One thing that you can do that's kind of similar to a site clone is you could actually export your old site. So in OU Campus, again, under Setup Sites, there's another drop-down where you can actually do a site export, and you can download all the files that you have on staging as a zip file, and that could be imported into your new site. And this is very much like what you saw when I was talking about that true copy. This really does a true copy as well, but only of the staging files. So it won't copy any of those dependency tags or any of those other settings that I was talking about previously. But what it does is you could, get kind of a starter site going with that. My recommendation, if you decide to go that route, is to revert the old site first, so that way you don't have any dependency tags pointing to the original site when you upload it. But it is an alternative way that you can do it, depending on if you want to bring things across, but maybe you don't want to bring across your different, extra settings with directory variables or, the different access settings or whatever you want to do. Maybe you don't want to bring those across, but you still want to bring the files across. This is one alternative way that you could do that. But it is just a true copy like I was talking about when you do the site clone. As far as the files are concerned, it is a true copy of the files when you actually export from the old site and import it into the new site. So be aware of that if you decide to use that route. Another alternative that you could use is actually just using alternate publish targets. So if you're not aware of alternate publish targets in OU Campus, what you can do is you can actually set one of these up so that OU Campus will be able to publish to multiple locations. And so you would set up the FTP credentials of where you want OU Campus to publish to as an alternate. You can choose which site settings that you actually have the production servers that you would now have at least 2 at this point if you set up at least one alternate publish target. You would decide which one that you want to point to as the default. And then the other one would be available as a drop-down when you go to publish your files and you see the box with final check and you hit the publish button there, as you should all be familiar with in OU Campus. And you would be able to choose where you want to publish your files to. So this is useful if you want to have the same files and you want to, publish out, one use case could be you could publish out to a test location before you publish out to the main live site, and you want to see how things work. You could just publish out to that location, and then when everything looks good, you could take the same content. You wouldn't have to change anything else in OU Campus, but just publish out your files. One thing to keep in mind if you do use that is that the resources are not necessarily duplicated unless you publish them to one or the other site specifically. So you would want to make sure that you publish all the relevant files when you need to when doing such a thing. But it can be an alternate to doing a site clone. Maybe you don't really need to have its own separate site. Maybe you actually just need to publish to 2 separate sites. If so, you could use alternate publish targets in OU Campus. Or there's another option. You could actually just create a new section in an existing site. Sometimes the purpose of why you would want to create a new site that's cloned is you want to, copy the resources and maybe just theme it a little differently or whatever. Where sometimes it might just be useful to create a new section that you have as a new subfolder in your existing site, and you can use, some XSL or, different pieces to customize just a major section in your site. And again, that can be done in the back end through the XSL, maybe with its own CSS that it calls and so on. Take a little bit development work to, make that set up the way you want to. But maybe you don't necessarily need a whole site to accomplish your purposes. This is particularly useful if in your site architecture, if you have a business section, say, that is kind of independent, it has its own theming, but it's still part of your school. They may have a subfolder where it's your school.edu/business, in which case creating a new section would probably make a lot of sense. But maybe they actually have their own subdomain and it's business. Whatever your school name is .edu. And in that case, then you have a new subdomain, so you need a different site. And so maybe a site clone would be a way that you want to copy some of those resources and everything over so you don't have to start with scratch with that. But these are all 3 of these different options are different alternatives that can be useful. And it's always good to know your options and what's possible and figure out how best to align that with what your actual needs are. And if you kind of look at these and you're not sure one way or another, which way to go with it, and it's like, it seems like maybe this is a good way, or maybe I want to do it this other way. We do have a wonderful support staff that is always happy to help and answer your questions, and we can help point you in the right direction if you're unsure on those things as well. So after the alternatives here, I also wanted to talk a little bit about some best practices that I've then identified as good things to keep in mind when you are considering using the site clone. And number 1 is just planning ahead. Plan. Like I was just talking about, if you make sure you understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish with it and make sure that you have all your information, and it'll go a lot smoother if you have this organized and you know exactly what you want to go and your purpose for the site clone. So in that line, ask questions. Get the answers to what kind of questions that you might have about site clone. Attend a training Tuesday on site clones, a good way to do it. But some of the questions that you might want to ask, I have listed here, is, where are you actually going to have that new site live? Particularly, with the production server, where is it going to be hosted? What are you going to name the new site in OU Campus? That's a unique name. If you have a subdomain, that's usually a really good candidate for that particular one. But figure out, where do you want that new site to live? And do you have the correct FTP credentials that you need, or SFTP, for OU Campus to publish to this new location that you're going to have for your cloned site? And if you don't have those, you want to get those and make sure that that's all set up so that when you go to clone your site, everything's ready to go. Another important question to ask yourself is, what do you actually want to copy from the old site? Are you just interested in keeping the site settings you had before so that you can start fresh, but all the content and everything in the site's going to be different. You just don't want to have to redo a lot of those site settings that you've customized and have worked well for you in the past. Then maybe you don't want to check that box to copy the staging files. On the other hand, maybe you do want to copy your staging files and bring those across. So just keeping track of what is it you want to bring across or not bring across will help you kind of decide the options that you want to do and if site clone is actually indeed the best option for your needs. Another question that is good to answer is, again, related to all this is, do you need to clone the site? Or, with those alternatives, is one of those better for your needs? Again, it's good to plan ahead on this, we do have, wonderful people here at Omni Update that are always happy to answer your questions and help you out on these things. Just thinking things through, making sure that you have everything that you want in order is always a good idea, and, not even just for site clone, but in general. Another thing that's fairly important to do when you're doing a site clone, best practice is to actually notify your users to not be active during the cloning process. And, one of the big reasons for this is just because when your users are working in your site and now you want to go and copy it over to somewhere else, you aren't going to necessarily know what state the cloned site is going to be in if people are making changes at the same time this automated process is going on. And another reason is if you decide to, do anything with Dependency Manager, if you use the, if you're disabling it or enabling it or whatever, that could potentially change, the user experience if they are moving pages and links need to update and so on. So usually just the best practice is just notify your users during this cloning time. It's a really quick time for the cloning, but just make sure that they're not going to be active during that time, and that'll be very useful. And as I mentioned before, it's very important, publish your files after you clone them so that they actually get pushed to the production server of wherever the new clone site is pointing to. Then finally, best practice is just to make sure you understand your options. A lot of the information that I've gone over here already is on this particular support site page that talks about site clone, as well as those graphics with Dependency Manager and so on. So you can get a lot of useful information there as a refresher, or there's some other bits of information that I didn't specifically cover here and won't be going over here today necessarily, but it's a good reference point as the support site is for so many other things. So that's kind of the best practices that I wanted to go over with site clone. And now that you've kind of seen enough of this PowerPoint, let's go take a look at it and see it in action here. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to OU Campus here.
And while you're doing that,
yeah.
One other question that came through, basically they just wanted you to go over again when site cloning is the best or the recommended choice, so kind of just when to use site clone, with some specific attention made to kind of what the publish target of the clone site looks like in those situations.
Okay, yeah. So, the best time really to use site clone, a lot of it will come down to your specific needs of what you want. So that's, some of it is, tailored to exactly what your strategies and stuff are for what you want it for. Typically, what I would use a site clone for is if I have a different subdomain or a different domain that I want to publish to, but I want to maybe copy over my files or my settings from my existing site, or access settings, directory variables, any of those different pieces that site clone will actually bring across. If you want to be able to reuse those for this new site, I think having a school of business or whatever type of an example is that has their own subdomain is a very good example of when you might want to use a site clone, because that really will allow you to have those different pieces in place that you have from your main site, You can start, even with the same templates and branding and everything you have, but since they're copied over, if you copy the files, you actually have a copy of it that you can then change, but starting at that same starting point. And so that would be kind of a good use case there. But at the same time, it does kind of come down to, your particular needs of, if there's any special considerations that you want to bring up, whether or not that would be the good one, a good path to take. And so, again, I do recommend if there's, specific considerations that you want, again, feel free to ask here if you have a specific one. But also we do have a, that great support team that we have that can, really help you succeed with this. All right, so this is some sites that I just happen to have set up. You can see my name all over them with these OU demo sites that I play around with from time to time. And so in here, I just happen to have 3 sites, and so let's, pretend that I want to clone this. And what I also am going to do, I'm going to bump this up just a little bit just to make sure that you all can see this easily. But, I could be, in my pages, and you can see, okay, here's a different set of files here. And let's assume that I have everything that I want to copy over into a new site, and I don't want to have to start this from scratch. So if I go to Setup and Sites, as I mentioned there, that's where it's actually located, and I click on that. Again, I do need to be a level 10 administrator to be able to do the site clone here. And so this is the site I want to copy from. So when you hover over a site in OU Campus, and you may be familiar with this, you can see that you have different options that appear over here on the right. You can actually, go into your site settings by clicking on the site or hitting Edit Site. You have all these different options you can choose. But the one that we are concerned about is under Actions here. And you can actually click Clone, and that'll start the site clone process of allowing you to enter in your data before the clone actually begins. Before I click that, I also just want to point out that export as zip file is where I had mentioned if you do want to export, your site and download it locally, if you did want to upload it without necessarily bringing other settings across. You can do that. Or if you just want to have it as a backup or anything else, whatever you need at that point. But that's also available in this view. You can also, since I talked so much about dependency scan, you can actually run a dependency scan on your site or revert the site, meaning the dependency tags, also from this view. And that will affect how the site gets cloned if you do either one of those things. However, before I actually clone the site, let me go to this existing site and show you the settings that I have here. So I have some server settings and credentials here. I have maybe direct edit button, all these different pieces that I have in place, the URL type if it was absolute, root relative, and so on, like I mentioned before. But also, if I go down to the very bottom here, you can see I do have Dependency Manager enabled on this site. So again, that's the best case scenario is you enable it here and you enable it on your other site, and OU Campus is going to convert any dependency tags that you have on your source site, and it's going to convert them properly so your clone site will then copy those options across for you. So again, this is where you actually enable or disable that, along with binary management. It behaves the same way if it's enabled. So let me go ahead and go out of that again. So if you want to clone the site, all we have to do is we just go to Actions and we hit Clone. And so you, like you've seen when you do a new site in OU Campus, if you've done that, you can see that there are different bold fields here, and these are the required fields that you need to fill out in order for this process to work. If I try to create something right now, OU Campus is going to complain to me and say, I'm not being nice, I need to play by the rules here, and it's going to then highlight and tell me, hey, you actually need to do this. So the site name that you pick, it really can be anything you want, but as long as you're using valid characters from OU Campus. But the restriction that you really want to pay attention to is it does have to be unique. So it can't match any other site name that you already have. And because of the uniqueness, that's where I was saying I do recommend that you give it a name that corresponds to where you're going to actually be publishing to. So if you have a different subdomain, the actual name of the subdomain is usually a really good candidate because it's probably going to be unique and it's going to be easy to remember. But really, the convention is up to you of what makes the most sense to you. So for the purposes of this demonstration here, I'm just going to call this Training Tuesday. And now that I fill that in, OU Campus says, okay, this is a I filled in the required field. It's not going to give me any issues with that now. I'm now doing what I'm supposed to be doing here. This box here, if I check it, will copy all those staging files over when I actually clone the site and I hit create at the bottom there. Or if I leave it unchecked like this, then the site settings only will be copied across, but the folders and files and the particular settings associated with them would not come across. So for this demonstration, I'll go ahead and include the staging files. But again, if you just wanted a clean site without any of those files from the old site over, you could leave that unchecked, and otherwise it would be giving you the same behavior here. The server settings, I'm going to do something here that is not my perfect recommended way of doing this, and that I'm actually going to use a subfolder of my existing site just because I actually don't have to create new site credentials for this. And but typically, you would actually have a different subdomain or something going here. But it's also an illustration that you can use a subfolder. So I'm just going to go and call this TT for Training Tuesday. And then I'm going to have my HTTP root match. So that way this folder is pointing to the same folder here that I have in the FTP side of things. If you're not familiar with site settings, you can also look on the support site. This help icon here also can allow you to get to the complete documentation on it. But the important thing to keep in mind here at this point is that the combination of your FTP root, HTTP root, and your server here, they do have to be unique. So if I had tried to create this site without putting these TTs in here or whatever difference that I had, OU Campus would not allow me to create two sites that publish to the exact same location. So this is my my new site. Again, the reason that this is not really the most recommended way of doing it is because I already have a site that publishes to this location. And this is a subfolder, so my other site, I could potentially affect this site if I created a TT folder in my original site. So I could then be publishing, over this one, or if that folder existed, this one could be publishing over that one. So you kind of have that race condition of whatever one happens last would be, out of the two sites would be the one that you see. So obviously that's not usually desirable, but it'll work for the purposes of this demonstration. I do wanted to just make sure I pointed out that's why typically that wouldn't be the recommended practice, but it is possible. The rest of the settings that you can see here, as I scroll through here, you can see they match exactly what I had before, all the different options that I had here. You may notice as you go through here, I don't see a couple things such as the LDP settings that you had in the site settings, and I don't see those alternate publish targets, the auxiliary sites that box that I had here initially. Once I create this, those will show up again, but just like when you're creating a new site, those options don't show until you actually create the site, and then you can go in and customize those afterwards. So if you notice that those weren't there, that's by design, and you just go in and you add those later. Another piece just kind of along those veins at the top is you notice there's no site UUID up here as well for that unique site ID. Usually that's typically used for LDP forms primarily on our end, but could be used for other purposes. but that's also not here until you create your site. Then it'll be given that ID and then the other options you would see as well. So I'm going to go ahead and create this clone site. So as soon as I hit create, like this, my combination of things it's telling me it's allowed. Again, like I said, that's why it's not recommended. But as soon as I click that button, my new site is now being cloned based off of the original source site that I had here. When the site clone is complete, you see this message here that everything worked. I now have my new site. So if I go back to content pages, you can see here's my original site that I had here. I can now switch over to my new site that I called Training Tuesday. And you'll see all these same pages and files that I had here before have been copied over. If I had any access settings or directory variables or whatnot in here, those you would also see as well. But if I go to the production tab, you'll see there's nothing there right now. So again, that's why it's important to publish things out, because right now none of these files or anything actually exist on production. They've only been copied to the OU campus staging environment here. So I can, take any of these pages. If I look at, my navigation include file, you can see there were some dependency tags here. So these should now be pointing to my new site, since I had dependency tag enabled for both my source and my clone site. But these will be pointing to my pages. And if I go ahead and publish this one, you can see when I publish it out, it's now publishing out to my new location, and I have my site page and so on has been created there. I would probably, normally I would actually publish all my resources first and then publish out the whole site just to make sure that everything gets pushed out and you can see your pages and everything as well. I don't think we need to go through that whole process right now, but that's what you would do since you'd just be kind of waiting for it there. But once you do that, and you now have this site, it's all ready for you to go. You can make any changes you want to your XSLs or your pages or content or whatever you want to do at this point, and it's ready for you to use and customize as you see fit. All right, so that's the all the fun of site clone here, and it really shows things there. Brandon, did we have any other questions that have popped up?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions that have come through. The first question is kind of an example situation. We have one person who did a clone, no dependency manager on the original site, into a clone site that is also no dependency manager. And he's wondering, what's the best way to get the binary files over to the clone site? Most of the binary files are on their production server, not on staging.
Okay, yes. So that's actually a really good question, and it's something that I have come across quite a few times. Often when we're doing migrations or different things like that, when you have your binary files, maybe you didn't have binary management enabled, and so they only exist on your production server. So in that case, you really have to answer the question first is, do you want those binary files to exist in your new site using binary management and put them on staging so you can manage them using the dependency tags, or do you just want to have it managed as before where you're going to push them out? And the reason that that question is kind of an important one is if you had you wanted to use binary management on your new site, but you didn't before, you could, you'd need to either way grab your files, so FTP or direct access to your server to grab all those files. Typically, if you do a filtered through FTP, that works pretty well. You can do that through a client such as FileZilla, where you can filter out certain file extensions or only include certain file extensions and so on. But you grab all those files from production. If you zip them up, you can upload them into OU Campus using the zip import feature. And that is right here. If you click upload, you can click import zip file, and you can either drag and drop that file from your desktop, or you can add it just by clicking here, and it'll bring up a dialog box to browse your file system. And so that's a way to get it into OU Campus. That works pretty well. If you aren't going to use binary management and all your files exist only on production and you want them to only exist on production on your new server, that your new production location, it might be the same server, but that new location that you're putting them to, then you might just want to copy those files from your server to the production server and bypass OU Campus if you're not going to use it. Again, you could zip import into OU Campus, but if you have binary management off and it's disabled, they would effectively do the same thing, and they would just get zip uploaded and pushed to production without being placed in the staging server environment. So in that case, usually the easiest thing is to actually just copy your environment that you have from production to the new one. If you don't want to have to deal with the filtering, you could actually do all your pages and everything that you have, because once you publish from OU Campus here, whatever you publish from OU Campus is going to overwrite those old files. So that's also a possibility if the filtering thing is a little, more than you want to do, and if you know that all the files initially are going to be the same, then you could just copy the whole environment over there.
Awesome. We got 2 more questions. Next question, this one might be a little shorter to answer. Aaron was wondering if he can clone a subfolder, i.e. a section, into another subfolder. I would presume within the same site. And Aaron, if you want to chime in and clarify that, that would be great. But I'm guessing within the same site.
Right, right. So it's a good question, but there isn't really a easy way to do a single folder to kind of duplicate those over in OU Campus. Typically, if you wanted to, copy, a folder, you could use that site export feature, and again, you export it as a zip file. That'll export everything from OU Campus, and you could, from that zip file, you could just take that one folder you want, change the name or just upload it to its new location, whatever, as its own individual zip file. That's kind of a nice workaround for it, but there's currently not an easy way just to, move it to another site. Within OU Campus, you can do a file copy of a particular folder. So if you're in OU Campus and you want to, copy this folder to another location, you can navigate wherever you want that to go and copy it, and that would work there. But when you're going from, one site to another or whatever, there's not an easy way to do a single folder. So that's kind of a nice workaround. If that's a feature that you're, you think would be really useful, and it'd be nice to be able to add into OU Campus. We do also have a feedback forum where you can actually make suggestions to our developers. It's feedback.omniupdate.com, and that's a good way to also bring up and upvote different features and things that you feel might be useful to be added to the product in the future, and our developers do look at that.
Mm-hmm. Aaron's question was specifically, he clarified that it was just cloning or copying one folder to another place within the same site. So luckily, we still have got the file copy. That'll be our easiest solution. This is something that that just kind of brings up a question of my own, Brian. When you copy an existing folder within the same site, does the new folder that you've copied retain the same access settings as the original?
I would have to look up that one and double check.
Okay, I was like, oh man, I don't remember off the top of my head either. So, okay, well, that satisfies, I guess, my curiosity there.
But we can test that one pretty quickly, and then put that with the notes for this Training Tuesday.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, final question. We have a customer who's using OU Search, and they're wondering, will my clone site be searched by default in our production site? It was the exact words of his question.
Okay. So yeah, with OU Search in particular, you tell it to you know, a particular URL or set of URLs that you want to scan, that they'll be crawled by the OU search engine. So if you clone a site, and if the location that is not specified in your OU search engine, then you would need to go into the search settings in OU search to be able to update that. If you clone something to, say, a subfolder or a folder that is already being crawled by your OU search, then the next time that search crawls and indexes your pages on your site, those would then be found at that point.
Okay, so just adding another base URL?
Correct.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, that's all the questions that I've got on my end. Was there any others that were sent to you directly or anything like that, Brian?
I did not see any others sent to me.
Okay, cool.
So I'll go ahead and take us back to the PowerPoint there, and if there's no other questions, the next Training Tuesday is going to be next month on October 31st. So it's a little spooky. You watch out here, but the topic will be CSS in OU Campus, and if you want more information, definitely visit OCN or the support site, and there's the links for them right there, so you can get further details as we get closer.
Yes, indeed. And before we sign off, one quick little thing. I know that typically once the session ends, there's a quick little survey that we send to you guys just to kind of see how we did with Training Tuesday. We have a new question for this survey. After October's Training Tuesday, we start getting into the holiday season with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and all those sort of holidays. For November and December, and that typically kind of interferes with when we typically would do a Training Tuesday on the last Tuesday of every month. So if you guys would be able to just provide your feedback as to what kind of schedule you would like to see would be the most useful for you guys for November and December's Training Tuesdays, we'd really appreciate your feedback. So we've got a couple options that we're thinking about. It's in the survey. Just go ahead and let us know which one works the best for you. We will use that to shape when we actually have Training Tuesdays for those end-of-year months. And I guess other than that, that pretty much wraps up what we have today. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate all of the questions and your attention for today. Everybody's recorded presentation materials, all of that stuff, we will be putting up on the support site, hopefully by the end of today, if not tomorrow. You can also see it at the OCN if you're there. And just as a reminder, I'll be pasting all that information into the chat right now. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. We will see you next month.